There's not a lot of middle ground when it comes to this story anymore. You either believe people were helping, or you believe people were exploiting. And tonight, a new twist just pushed that divide even further. Because when money, contracts, addiction allegations, and felony charges collide around a family that became famous overnight and odd, things stop being simple. They start becoming layered. Let's begin with what's being discussed right now. There was reportedly a contract. Not a handshake, not a verbal promise. A contract. A document that outlined how money generated from content involving the Whittaker family would be distributed. And according to statements circulating, that contract allegedly promised structured payments to the family. But here's where the tension begins. There are claims that the family only received around $1,200 plus groceries, despite much larger sums being generated through monetized platforms. Now pause. These are allegations. They are not convictions. They are not verdicts. They are claims tied to ongoing legal matters. And that distinction matters. Because right now, the person at the center of those allegations is facing felony charges, but remains legally innocent unless proven guilty in court. Still, the existence of a contract changes the conversation. Because contracts aren't emotional. They're enforceable. If one side did not uphold their end, that becomes a civil issue. Civil court. Restitution. Damages. Accounting. That's separate from criminal charges. Criminal court determines whether laws were broken. Civil court determines whether agreements were violated. And right now, both shadows are hanging over this story. Now let's talk about something that people keep coming back to. The car. There was a vehicle purchased, publicly framed as something good, something generous, something helpful. But then the vehicle was returned. And that's where speculation began. Was the car a genuine gift? Or was it an attempt to show visible support at a moment when scrutiny was building? Was it generosity or positioning? Again, speculation is not proof. But optics matter. When someone facing allegations of financial exploitation can point to a large visible purchase, I bought them a car, that becomes narrative armor. It becomes something you can say in your defense. Look what I did. Look what I provided. Look what they received. But according to accounts circulating, there were disputes even around the sale of that vehicle, including claims that the price was adjusted after mechanical concerns were raised. Whether money was ultimately exchanged remains unclear, and that uncertainty feeds the larger issue. Transparency. Because from the beginning, the Whittakers were thrust into a spotlight. When Mark Laita introduced them to the world, they became something rare. A rural Appalachian family turned viral phenomenon. And from that moment forward, money entered the picture. Donations, GoFundMe campaigns, ad revenue, monetized videos, restaurant tabs paid by strangers, gifts, cash. They became, in a way, local celebrities. People wanted photos. People wanted to help. People wanted to say they did something. That kind of attention is powerful and dangerous, because when vulnerable adults become famous, they don't suddenly gain financial literacy. They don't suddenly understand contracts. They don't suddenly manage accounting. They rely on others, and that reliance is where exploitation or misunderstanding can occur. Now here's where tonight's twist deepens. Felony charges were filed. 11 of them. That's not minor. That's serious. But again, charges are not convictions. The accused has the right to bond, the right to defense, the right to a trial, the right to be presumed innocent. And while some people online are already declaring guilt, the legal system hasn't. Still, when felony charges intersect with a contract dispute, the narrative shifts from drama to documentation. Because prosecutors don't operate on vibes. They operate on evidence. Bank records, platform payouts, contract language, witness testimony, financial tracing. And if there was a contract, that document becomes central. Did it promise equal distribution? Did it specify percentages? Did it clarify who owned the content? Did it detail payment schedules? Those details matter more than opinions. Now step back. There has always been a divide in this story. One camp says the Whittakers were helped. Another camp says they were exploited. Very little middle ground. That divide began years ago with debates over filming, donations, and dignity. And it has only widened with each new personality entering the orbit. Because once money starts flowing, trust becomes currency. And trust erodes quickly when questions arise. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The Whittakers didn't seek national fame. They didn't draft contracts. They didn't negotiate at revenue percentages. They didn't launch monetized platforms. They became content. And when content becomes income, someone controls the income. That control is what's being examined now. And until a courtroom reviews the evidence, the rest is noise. But here's what makes this a breaking twist tonight. The conversation has moved from rumor to record, from YouTube comments to court filings, from speculation to structured proceedings. That's a shift. When someone is already on probation and then gets hit with new felony charges, the situation changes instantly. It's no longer just about the new accusations. It becomes about two timelines colliding. The old case and the new case. Because probation is conditional freedom. It's the court saying, you don't go to jail as long as you stay clean. Now, what does stay clean usually mean? It means no new criminal charges, no violations of court orders, compliance with financial obligations, compliance with any specific restrictions. If new felony charges are filed while someone is on probation, that almost automatically triggers a probation review. Not because they've been convicted, but because probation requires lawful behavior. And being charged with serious felonies is enough to raise red flags. Now let's clarify something important. Charges are allegations. They are claims made by the state based on evidence they believe is sufficient to prosecute. They are not proof of guilt. In the United States legal system, a person is innocent until proven guilty. That means the burden of proof is on the prosecution. A judge or jury must evaluate evidence. Conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But probation is different from a new criminal trial. At a probation revocation hearing, the standard of proof is often lower. The judge doesn't need to determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They need to determine whether probation conditions were violated. That's a different threshold. Now, if the new felony charges are related to financial exploitation or contract disputes involving the Whittaker family, then the court will examine not just criminal liability, but behavior. Was there misrepresentation? Was there misuse of funds? Was there deception? Was there reckless disregard for contractual obligations? And if prosecutors believe they can show that conduct violated probation terms, the judge has options. Those options typically include continuing probation unchanged, modifying probation with stricter conditions, revoking probation and imposing the suspended sentence. That suspended sentence matters, because when probation was granted previously, jail time was suspended. That means it's still there, waiting. If revoked, the court can reinstate that jail time. Now here's where the Whittaker narrative intersects with legal structure. For years, the story was emotional. Were they helped? Were they exploited? Was it charity? Was it monetization? Now that there are felony charges involved, the discussion moves into evidence. Contracts, payment records, platform monetization reports, donation receipts, transfer logs, bank statements. If there was a contract, it becomes central. Contracts in civil law define obligations. If one party failed to meet their obligations, that's typically a civil dispute. But if prosecutors believe there was intentional deception or fraudulent conduct, that crosses into criminal territory. That's the line that courts will examine. Now let's address the contract issue directly. If a contract promised certain payments to the Whittakers and they allegedly received only $1,200 plus groceries, then questions arise. Was the contract properly executed? Did all parties understand its terms? Were payments made according to agreement? Were revenues accurately disclosed? Civil court handles breach of contract. Criminal court handles fraud. They are not the same, but sometimes they overlap. If someone knowingly misrepresented earnings or intentionally withheld funds under false pretenses, prosecutors can elevate that to criminal conduct. That's likely what investigators are examining. Now here's another factor. The Whittakers became, in a way, public figures. Not celebrities in the traditional sense, but recognizable. Local restaurants reportedly paid their tabs. Strangers offered gifts. Cash was given. Support poured in. When that happens, tracking money becomes complicated, because not all income flows through one source. Add revenue from Facebook. Add revenue from YouTube. Direct donations. GoFundMe campaigns. Cash payments. That creates multiple streams. And if someone was acting as intermediary, collecting, distributing, or managing funds, transparency becomes critical. Because vulnerable adults cannot audit accounts. They cannot demand financial statements. They rely on trust. And trust is now under examination. Now, about the car purchase. Large visible purchases can serve as narrative proof. I bought them a car. But the question isn't whether something was purchased. The question is, whose money funded it? Was it documented? Was it part of contractual obligation? Was ownership clear? Was it returned? Was payment exchanged? If there were discrepancies in how that transaction unfolded, investigators would likely review it closely, because vehicles leave paper trails, titles, bills of sale, insurance, registration, financing records. Those documents don't rely on memory. They rely on paperwork. Now let's step back to probation again. If someone is on probation and facing 11 felony charges, judges pay attention. Not because conviction has occurred, but because the seriousness of the allegations reflects risk. Courts consider public safety, or risk of reoffending, compliance history, nature of alleged conduct. Financial crimes involving vulnerable adults carry weight, especially when those adults are incapacitated, because exploitation statutes often include enhanced penalties when victims are disabled or elderly. If prosecutors pursue that angle, it raises the stakes significantly. But again, charges are not verdicts. The accused has the right to defend themselves. And sometimes charges are reduced. Sometimes cases are dismissed. Sometimes plea agreements occur. Sometimes juries acquit. The legal system moves slower than public opinion. Now here's the biggest shift. For years, debate about the Whittakers lived online, in comment sections, in live stream chats, in reaction videos. Now it lives in courtrooms. That changes everything, because courtrooms operate on evidence, not engagement. The audience doesn't vote. The judge rules. And when legal rulings happen, they reshape narratives permanently. If probation is revoked, that signals judicial concern. If probation continues, that signals judicial caution. If felony charges lead to conviction, that solidifies one side of the debate. If charges collapse, that reshapes perception entirely. That's why this moment feels different. It's not just another online argument. It's structured, documented, procedural. When contracts involve vulnerable adults, the legal standards tighten. Not emotionally, legally, because the law recognizes something important. Consent and capacity matter. If someone signs a contract, the court must consider whether they understood what they were signing. That's not an insult. It's a legal question. Capacity to contract requires the ability to understand the nature of the agreement, The obligations involved. The consequences of signing. If an individual has significant developmental disabilities, courts may examine whether they had legal capacity to enter into that agreement. If they did not, the contract could be challenged. Now apply that to the Whittaker situation. If there was a written contract regarding monetized content and revenue distribution, several questions become central. Who signed it? Who explained it? Who witnessed it? Was legal counsel involved? Did the vulnerable parties have independent representation? If the contract was signed by a family member acting as guardian or representative, then the court examines authority. Did that person have legal guardianship? Was that guardianship documented? Was court approval required? Because contracts involving incapacitated adults often require additional oversight. If those safeguards weren't in place, a contract can become legally vulnerable. Now let's separate two paths clearly. Civil liability and criminal liability are different. Civil court handles breach of contract, failure to distribute agreed funds, misrepresentation in private agreements, restitution claims. Criminal court handles fraud, exploitation of vulnerable adults, intentional deception for financial gain. The difference lies in intent. Civil court asks, did someone fail to fulfill their obligation? Criminal court asks, did someone knowingly and intentionally deceive or exploit? That's a higher bar. And when prosecutors file felony charges, they are alleging criminal intent. That's serious. But proving intent is complex. It requires financial records, communication records, witness testimony, evidence of awareness. If someone genuinely believed they were entitled to a certain share of monetization, proving criminal deception becomes harder. If someone concealed earnings or fabricated distributions, proving intent becomes easier. That's why evidence matters. Now let's talk about monetization structure. When content is posted on platforms like Facebook or YouTube, revenue comes from ad views, engagement metrics, subscriber thresholds, platform algorithms. Revenue fluctuates. It's not a fixed paycheck. It can vary by month. That creates ambiguity. If a contract promised shared earnings, was that gross revenue or net revenue? Before expenses, after expenses, were production costs deducted? Travel costs, equipment, editing? Contracts often define these details. If the language was vague, disputes arise. And when disputes involve vulnerable adults, the optics intensify. Now let's examine something else that courts consider. Pattern. If prosecutors can show a pattern of large earnings publicly visible, minimal distributions privately documented, inconsistent explanations, attempts to reposition funds, that strengthens their case. If, on the other hand, financial records show consistent distributions, documented expenses, and clear communication, defense strengthens. The car purchase becomes relevant here. If a vehicle was purchased using monetized funds, investigators will ask, was it purchased for the Whittakers? Was title transferred properly? Was ownership documented? Was it returned? If so, why? Vehicles leave trails. Title history, VIN records, insurance coverage, maintenance logs. Those details can clarify intent. Now let's talk about restitution. If criminal court determines that funds were improperly withheld or misused, the judge can order restitution. Restitution requires repayment to victims. It is separate from jail time. Even if probation is revoked, restitution can still be ordered. If the matter remains civil, the Whittakers, or their legal representatives, would need to file a lawsuit for breach of contract. That would involve filing in civil court, presenting the contract, demonstrating failure to pay, seeking damages. Civil cases require preponderance of evidence, a lower threshold than criminal court, meaning more likely than not. That's easier to prove than beyond a reasonable doubt. But civil court requires plaintiffs to initiate action. Criminal court is initiated by the state. That's an important distinction. Now let's widen the lens. This case may reshape how Monet's content involving incapacitated individuals is handled nationwide. Because once felony charges intersect with digital monetization and vulnerable adults, creators take notice. Contracts will become tighter. Guardianship documentation will become clearer. Revenue transparency will become more common. Because no one wants to be the next example. For years, content involving vulnerable individuals operated in a gray area. Was it documentary? Was it exploitation? Was it awareness? Was it profit? Now that courts are involved, gray areas shrink. And creators who film individuals with disabilities will likely use written agreements, provide financial accounting, consult attorneys, seek guardianship confirmation, document distributions carefully. That's not a reaction to guilt. It's a reaction to risk. Now let's address the emotional layer. The Whittakers did not create this structure. They became subjects of it. They became content. They became monetized. They became contractual. That's the reality of viral exposure. And when financial incentives enter the picture, human behavior shifts. Trust becomes transactional. Support becomes measurable. Disputes become legal. And when disputes involve individuals who cannot easily advocate for themselves, the law steps in more aggressively. Now, none of this determines outcome. Charges must be proven. Contracts must be interpreted. Evidence must be evaluated. But this case has already done one thing. It moved the Whittaker narrative from emotional debate to legal analysis. That's a permanent shift. When someone is facing new felony charges while already on probation, the legal strategy becomes complicated fast. Because now there are two battles happening at once. One is about the new allegations. The other is about trust already extended by the court. Probation is not just freedom with conditions. It is judicial grace. It is a judge saying, I'm giving you an opportunity instead of incarceration. When new charges surface during that period, even before a conviction, the optics are difficult. Now let's talk about bond. A lot of people assume that if someone doesn't immediately post bond, it means guilt. That's not necessarily true. Bond decisions depend on several factors: financial ability, risk of flight, nature of the alleged crime, prior record, probation status, advice of counsel. In some cases, defendants remain in custody strategically. Why? Because time served before trial can sometimes count towards sentencing if there is a conviction. Defense attorneys sometimes calculate risk and say, if you are facing potential incarceration anyway, pretrial custody may reduce overall exposure. That doesn't mean guilt. It means strategy. Now, probation complicates bond further. If someone is on probation and then charged with new felonies, courts often treat them as higher risk. Because probation requires lawful behavior. So even if bond is technically available, the judge may set a higher secured bond, require property collateral, deny bond entirely in some cases. Secured bond usually means 10% must be paid to a bondsman or collateral property must be posted. If someone cannot access funds quickly, they remain in custody. And in cases involving alleged financial exploitation, public perception adds pressure, because now the alleged conduct relates to money. So the public may ask, if there was all this money, why can't bond be posted? But that question assumes liquidity. Monetized revenue does not always equal accessible cash. Platform payouts fluctuate. Taxes may be owed. Expenses may have been paid. Funds may be tied up. And defense attorneys often advise clients not to liquidate assets hastily before legal clarity. Now let's examine probation revocation hearings more closely. A revocation hearing is not a criminal trial. There is no jury. The judge reviews whether the probation terms were violated. The burden of proof is lower than in criminal court. That means even if felony charges are not yet proven, the judge could still determine that the allegations alone represent a violation of probation conditions. And if probation is revoked, the suspended sentence can be activated. That's the risk. Now here's the strategic tension. If probation is revoked before the felony trial concludes, the defendant may begin serving time for the original offense. If later acquitted of the new charges, that doesn't automatically undo time served for the probation revocation. That's why defense attorneys fight hard at revocation hearings. Because losing that hearing can lock in months of incarceration before the felony case even goes to trial. Now consider public perception. Online narratives often move faster than court proceedings. People see felony charges and assume guilt. But the legal system requires evidence, process, and procedural fairness. Defense teams will likely argue. The charges are allegations, not proof. Or financial disputes can be civil, not criminal. Contract misunderstandings do not equal fraud. There was no intent to deceive. Prosecutors, on the other hand, must show intentional misrepresentation, knowing misuse of funds, vulnerable victims, clear financial discrepancies. Intent is the battlefield. Because if the defense can create reasonable doubt about intent, criminal conviction becomes difficult. Now here's where the Whittaker family dynamic intersects with strategy. The prosecution may argue that vulnerable adults were exploited. That carries emotional weight. But emotional weight is not enough. They must show money was generated, money was owed, money was withheld intentionally, and they must do it with documentation. Defense will likely scrutinize exact contract wording, communication history, accounting records, expense allocations. If the contract language was vague, that benefits defense. If payment schedules were undefined, that benefits defense. If communication shows ongoing negotiation or confusion, that benefits defense. Now let's talk about the larger impact. Regardless of outcome, this case is going to influence how creators interact with vulnerable subjects in the future. If someone films incapacitated individuals and monetizes that content, they will now understand. Contracts must be airtight. Distributions must be documented. Guardianship must be verified. Revenue must be transparent. Because once prosecutors enter the picture, the bar changes. Now, here's another factor rarely discussed. Sometimes plea agreements happen quietly. If prosecutors believe they have leverage but not a guaranteed conviction, they may offer reduced charges in exchange for restitution or admissions. Defense may weigh a risk of prison time, a risk of public trial, financial consequences, reputation damage. But until that happens, speculation remains speculation. Right now, what exists are charges, probation status, bond decisions, scheduled hearings, legal maneuvering, and public debate. Now let's address something important. It is possible for someone to believe they were helping and still mishandle money. It is possible for someone to believe they were entitled to revenue and still violate contractual terms. Intent and impact are not always aligned. That's why courts exist, to separate narrative from evidence. And that separation is happening now. At the center of all of this, the contracts, the charges, the probation hearings, the bond discussions, are three people who did not design any of it. Timmy, Ray, Lorraine. They didn't negotiate percentages. They didn't draft agreements. They didn't structure monetization. They became the subject of a story that grew larger than anyone expected. And now that story is in a courtroom. So what does this legal storm actually mean for the Whittaker family moving forward? First, it changes who controls the narrative. For years, the narrative lived online, in videos, live streams, reaction channels, comment sections. Now it lives in filings, affidavits, motions, evidence disclosures. That shift removes a lot of public influence. Courtrooms don't operate on engagement. They operate on proof. And while the public may continue debating who helped and who exploited, the legal system will be focused on documentation. Second, it affects trust permanently. Even if charges are reduced, even if probation continues, even if the case resolves quietly, the question of money will linger. Because once financial allegations surface in a case involving vulnerable adults, that shadow doesn't disappear easily. Future creators will think twice before entering that space. Future contracts will be tighter. Future distributions will be clearer. Future relationships will be documented. And that may be one of the lasting consequences. Hey. Now let's talk about the family's present reality. The Whittakers are no longer sitting on the porch in the way they once were. They are under state oversight, structured care, supervised environments, and that changes how outside parties interact with them. If financial disputes exist, legal representatives will likely be involved now. Guardians, court-appointed advocates, protective services. Access becomes formal, which means monetized content, informal agreements, and handshake arrangements are unlikely to happen again the way they once did. That door is probably closed. Now here's the harder question. Can the family ever go back to normal? Probably not. Too much has happened. Too many personalities entered the orbit. Too much money circulated. Too many allegations surfaced. Too many legal filings now exist. Even if everyone wanted to reset, the structure has changed. When courts become involved, systems tighten. And once systems tighten, spontaneity fades. But there's another layer to this. Sometimes legal storms create clarity. If wrongdoing is proven, accountability happens. If wrongdoing is not proven, that clarity also matters. Because speculation thrives in ambiguity. Court rulings end ambiguity. They don't always satisfy everyone, but they define reality in a way online debate cannot. Now let's address something important. Charges are still allegations. The accused is still innocent unless proven guilty. That principle matters, especially in cases that carry emotional weight. It's easy to declare someone guilty when vulnerable adults are involved. It's harder, but necessary, to allow due process. Because the legal system protects everyone by protecting process. If probation is revoked, that will signal judicial concern. If probation continues, that signals caution. If felony charges move forward to trial, evidence will be tested publicly. And if plea agreements occur, those details will eventually surface as well. Whatever the outcome, the Whittaker story will not return to what it was. It has crossed into institutional oversight. And institutional oversight rarely retreats. What happens next will likely involve structured care decisions, legal guardianship oversight, controlled access, reduced informal monetization, and that may ultimately protect the family more than any viral spotlight ever did. Because the most important question isn't who won an argument online. It's whether the vulnerable adults at the center are protected, not as content, not as symbols, but as people. This case has already changed the conversation about filming, contracts, and monetization involving incapacitated individuals. It has already made creators more cautious. It has already pushed financial transparency into focus. And whether that change came through controversy or correction, it's real. Now the rest belongs to the courts. If you followed this case closely, share your thoughts respectfully below. Do you think this legal shift ultimately protects the family, or does it complicate their future even further? One thing is certain. This story is no longer just about views. It's about verdicts. And those carry weight long after the cameras turn off.